Suzanne LaGrande, and this is Disobedient Femmes. Today, my guest is Kate Hodges. Kate has written for numerous publications, including The Face and the Green Parent magazine, published a travel guide and a map of the occult places in London, and most recently, she's published Warriors, Witches, and Women, Mythology's Fiercest Females. She also plays in a band called Ye Nuns. How cool is that? Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Warriors, Witches, and Women is a collection of stories introducing fascinating female figures from world mythologies. Can you talk about how you came up with the idea for this book?
I've always been interested in goddesses, mythology, the supernatural world, and monsters and witches, but I've always been interested in them from a kind of cultural perspective. It's not I haven't had a background in classics. I haven't even got a history degree. I come at them from watching films like Jason and the Argonauts or Clash of the Titans and kind of learning about them through that, and reading books about ghosts and reading books about monsters. And I really wanted to bring all of those kind of aspects together and kind of fuse it with my feminism, which, you know, it just kind of runs through my everyday life and kind of infuses everything I do. And I wanted to do something that brought all of those things together. And this book is it. And I kind of proposed it to a publisher and they liked the idea. So I went for it. And I'm just really, really pleased with how it's come out.
It looks great too. It has wonderful illustrations in addition to great stories.
Yeah, that's Harriet Lee Merriam did the illustrations, and I think she's a genius. I think her illustrations are absolutely beautiful, really simple, but they just capture an essence of
it's the kind of book that you really want to have on your shelf and to go look at again and peruse because of its lovely, you know, the lovely quality of the book itself.
Yeah, thank you. I made it to kind of dip into, you know, you don't need to sit down and read the whole lot in one go. You can dip into it, and also younger readers will find something, but readers of all ages will find something. You know, it really is aimed at adults, but children will find something to interest them in there too.
The book is divided into sections. You have witches, warriors, bringers of misfortune, elemental spirits, and beneficent spirits. I'm wondering if you could talk about this classification, and also you include Cassandra, who's a figure from Greek mythology, under the category of witches. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, sure. So I divided them into chapters because I think, you know, that makes it easier to read, easier to digest. You know, as you approach each chapter, what you'll find inside. So warriors are fighters and strategists, not necessarily, you know, some of them are aggressive and muscular, but some of them are more kind of strategy based, and or they'll kind of wreak justice upon people. There's bringers of misfortune, which is I love bringers of misfortune. That's all about the kind of destructive whirlwind women who go in and kind of wreak havoc across the world. And women like the Harpies and Medusa. Elemental spirits is all about the kind of wild women who harness the seas and the elements and the weather, and the people like Mari and the rainbow serpent. And munificent spirits are the kind of the bountiful mother goddesses, domestic goddesses, and who kind of specifically female, but they all have a darker side too. I think all of these women have a darker side. And yeah, Cassandra, I put her in the witches. She was a difficult one to categorize. She's very difficult. I mean, she could almost go into a few categories. I mean, she wasn't a warrior, but she could definitely be a bringer of misfortune. And but I put her in the witches category because I thought her gift was a supernatural power. She had that gift of sight, of second sight, and so I put her into the witches category. I think she's so interesting, Cassandra. She was granted the gift of being able to predict events by kings. No, it's by Apollo gave her the gift to predict events, and so not only was she given the gift to predict events, that was matched with a kind of inversion of that, where all the prophecies, although they're accurate, nobody would believe them, and it's awful. It's like a nightmare, you know.
It strikes me that there's something very salient in her story for this time.
Absolutely, and I think for many different women at this point, there's a lot of resonance in this. I think especially in kind of in the ecological movement, in the climate change movement, it feels sometimes like you're shouting into a void. You're telling scientists are telling the truth. They have been telling us what's happening for the last 30 years, and yet people are choosing to ignore that, or it's falling on deaf ears. Women have been talking about their experiences. Me Too movement, women have spoken about these experiences. It seems, you know, it's hardly news. There's been a trail of breadcrumbs left for the last 40 years, and yet, you know, it's taken this long for women's voices to be heard and to be recognised and taken account of and believed, most importantly.
There's even the term the Cassandra syndrome.
Of course.
To describe this, particularly used in the environmental movement, but to describe the phenomenon of people telling the truth and not being heard.
That's right. And I think that's incredible, is that this story that was written so many thousands of years ago still feels, I mean, it's like, come on, how long are we going to have to put up with this shit? You know, it's still resonant. It still has resonance for women in the world today, and that just it's almost ridiculous. It's almost laughable that still people are telling their truths and not being listened to.
Yeah. A lot of women's histories have been hidden or not well documented in history. Is this also true for the figures in your book, some of whom were based on actual women? Was it difficult to find this information?
Absolutely. I think there's a really good, my favorite example of that is the Roman goddess, who's Bona Dea. She's kind of cloaked in mystery. So she was a goddess who existed. She had a temple in Rome, and specifically she was a woman's goddess, and that's kind of, it's so vague. It's just, women would go and worship this goddess in a temple. They'd have these bacchanalian feasts where they drink wine and have music and get really drunk, and they'd turn all of the paintings to the wall so they weren't watched. But historians kind of have no idea what she was worshipped for. They think she might be something to do with fertility, or perhaps something to do with medicine, specifically female medicine. I mean, it could be something to do with the menopause. She's really hazy, and I guess the reason for that is that the historians were mainly men. They didn't get to go in and to worship this goddess. They didn't get to go into her temple, so we have really very little evidence of what she was about, or why she existed, what purpose she served. And I think it's really fascinating. I think that's kind of indicative of a wider thing that happens in women's history, that we don't get written about. Women's day-to-day lives don't get written about in history because women couldn't write. They had more of an oral tradition. That most women weren't educated. So there is no written evidence for us to look at now. It's just kind of the odd statue or perhaps some oral evidence.
It's quite amazing given that fact that you were able to find out, I think, so much about some of these figures that are in your book. One that was new to me, I found very interesting under the category of warriors, was the legend of Yennenga, a warrior princess that in what is now northern Ghana,
That's
whose
right.
story was kept alive through oral tradition for 900 years. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about her story and why she's so interesting.
Yeah, well, Yanenga she lived in what was now northern Ghana, and her story, I mean, her story just kind of shouts off the page. So she must have been an incredible woman. She was the daughter of King Yennenga, and all her three brothers were kind of warriors, and her father encouraged her to kind of get into spear throwing. He taught her how to ride a horse. And he taught her, most importantly, he taught her strategy. So she went out and she won victories for his army. And it's almost like he created this woman who is so powerful, so strong, that it was almost like it was too much for her. He'd send her out to battle, and she wanted to go. She wanted to be a normal teenager. She wanted to have boyfriends. She wanted to have babies. And every time she asked if her father if she could go and have a boyfriend or think about having a family. He was freaked out because he wanted her to stay in his army and to keep winning battles for her. So in the end, she had to run away, and she ran away and she found love and had a child, and there was a reconciliation with her father. But I think it's really interesting that she kind of turned that kind of female archetype of the strong warriors, kind of turned it on her head, said, yes, I am that strong warrior, I am a great strategist, I win battles, but also I want to have love, I want to have a family, I want to have all the traditional life as well, I want to have it all. And I think she is an incredible story. She was obviously an amazing person, or her story wouldn't have survived for 900 years. There wouldn't be statues of her in the street now, which there are.
And again, it's such an interesting story that is so relevant for our times, right? The conflict for women about being able to do lots of things that are important.
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of, it's all about not being one-dimensional, not being a stereotype. You know, yes, she was a great warrior, but yes, she still wanted to have a child, and there's nothing wrong with having a child. That was her feminism. That was her path that she wanted to follow. And my God, she had to fight for it, but she got there. You know, she got there. Not only did she have a child, but you know, in the end, she made up with her father, and there was kind of reconciliation. So yeah, I think it's really, really, it feels so fresh when you read that story. I think it was quite shocking how fresh and relevant it felt. You know, it's kind of, you think of goddesses, you think of these stories as being quite dusty and dry, but actually, you know, she goes out and she plants this field of okra, and then she just lets it die, and she said to her dad, look, that's how I am, that's my ovaries rotting away in the fields.
It's a great line. It's so great. You say here, this field looks like how I feel. Here I am, my ovaries withering and dying, my soul crying out for someone, and you don't care.
It's so teenage, and I love it. It's like, yeah, here she is, this great battler, this amazing warrior goddess, and she's basically furious at her dad for not letting her have a boyfriend, which I just love.
How did you decide who to include in the book? I mean, there were so many others, right?
Oh yes, I mean, I really had to whittle it down from hundreds, and there was lots that I was kind of really sad to lose. But I just wanted a really good cross section. I wanted it to be intersectional. I wanted it to have globally a global spread of women in this book. I didn't want it all just to come from the kind of well-trodden classics. So I chose people who told a kind of who illustrated different forms of femininity and the female experience. So, you know, there are people who are real homebodies in this. There are goddesses who are literally creating worlds, and there are goddesses who live by the fireside and are nurturing. And I wanted to choose people who had stories that still resonated today, that still had something that we could all find resonance with, but also goddesses that looked incredible and looked diverse, so that the illustrations look good, and just people whose stories would resonate with us, and, you know, with our daughters and with our mothers, just a wide range of experiences.
Why do you think it's important for everyone, women and men, to know about some of these figures in the past?
Well, first of all, it's great just to read about them, just on a really basic level. It's brilliant to absorb these stories. You know, if it, you can read these and just read the stories, and you would come away feeling enthused and inspired by these stories. But also, I think it's important because of what they illustrate, what they show us. So somebody like Medusa, who has been traditionally kind of demonized, monsterized, and it's really what I want to do is kind of dig behind the monsterization, find out why she had been monsterized, find out how she'd been monsterized, how her story had been kind of told and retold in different ways, how she'd been used as a totem of all that is wicked about women, all of that's monstrous about women, but actually kind of just chip away and find out what the story was underneath. And I think it's what I was really kind of surprised about when I was researching this was the way that different women's stories have changed over the years. So over the years, depending on who's telling the story. So if lots of them have kind of been used to demonize religions, to demonize ways of living. They've had their stories retold by, often the Christian church has retold their stories in ways to make them as figureheads for all that's bad in the world. But actually, when you dig into their stories are the most incredible stories. They're inspiring. Somebody like Jezebel, who has kind of demonized by the writers in the Bible, but actually when you look at her story, she's the most incredible, strong woman who kind of, you know, she was, you think of her as this woman who kind of puts makeup on and is a hussy, but actually she put makeup on because that was her war paint in her final hour. She was putting it on, making herself strong before she came downstairs, finished. She knew that her life was going to be over. She knew she was facing her enemies, and she faced them looking as sensational as she always had.
Hmm. From history, we know that many of the women who were labeled witches were often healers and were persecuted. Scholars estimate between 40,000 and 100,000 people, mainly women, were executed for witchcraft. I'm wondering how that shapes the story that we hear, and also our ideas about female power.
Well, I think it's really interesting that yes, that women were prosecuted for witchcraft were often healers, or they were women who dealt with childbirth, or they were kind of death doulas. So it was death was seen as a woman's task. They would wrap the bodies. They would take them to be buried. They would help the family through that process, and herbal knowledge, knowledge of plants, is all these things were women's skills. There would be a woman in the village who had these skills. You'd go and visit, and she would cure you of your warts, or she would cure you of the ague, and she'd bring out her poultices made from these plants. And and those women were they were a threat, and they were a threat to patriarchal society. They were a threat to Christian society very often, and in order to kind of to demonize that religion, in order to get dominance, then men and the Christian church would nudge people into witch hunts. They'd nudge people into condemning that woman in the village. It was the church would send in a priest before they built the church. They sent in a priest, and just kind of nudge people towards pushing out anybody who might be seen to be a threat. And these women were demonized, and they weren't given a chance. Obviously, in their trials, often they'd be, for instance, they would be thrown into a lake, and then if they rose to the surface, then they would be they were witches and they were burnt. And if they sunk to the bottom, oh dear, they weren't witches, but they drowned.
Talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Exactly, yeah. And the witch finder generals would have these prickers that kind of disappeared into the handles. So you'd think that these women were being pricked and yet felt no pain, but actually, Matthew Hopkins had his finger pricker that disappeared up into his handles, so nobody would feel any pain. It was the system was rigged against these women, and I think over the years you can see that archetype will kind of found its way into fairy tales. It found its way into the story of Baba Yaga, into Bechta. Bechta was a nurturing goddess at one point, and then she kind of got just kind of pushed into this stereotype of a witch. Baba Yaga too, she kind of got pushed into this stereotype of a witch. These were the women that you should avoid, that you had to shun, and actually the reason that you had to shun them was because you've been prompted into and prodded into shunning them.
So given this history, we shouldn't believe many of the stories that we have heard in fairy tales or perhaps even in movies about the terrible woman archetype, right? I mean, we have a lot of femme fatales and witches and evil stepmothers, all of whom put a lot of blame, really are a convenient scapegoat, I think.
Absolutely. Completely. They're a convenient scapegoat. They're a way of kind of personifying everything that scares patriarchal society about women, into one thing. I mean, I enjoy a good witch. Don't get me wrong. I love a scary witch. I love watching any films with witches in them. But I like turning that archetype on its head. I like digging into that archetype and kind of embracing that archetype as well. I think I would love to be called a witch, and I think more and more. So I think that's happening more and more. I mean, you see the kind of the girls hexing Donald Trump, and you see the kind of there's kind of girls coming together and calling themselves witches and having covens, and that language has kind of been turned on its head a little and embraced by kind of girls, and I love that. I think that's a really healthy place.
And I think that your book is in some ways helping to rewrite the history of what those figures mean.
I think so. I hope so. Yeah, I think it's interesting to not take anything at face value. It's interesting, we've all grown up on Disney films and seen these kind of literally two-dimensional witches, but it's really interesting to kind of dig back further, dig beyond the fairy tales, find the roots of the fairy tales. Fairy tales are stories of goddesses that have been dormant for years and years. Very often you'll find at the root of fairy tales is some old goddess, centuries, millennia old goddess, whose story has survived through fairy tales. I mean, it's an oral tradition. Fairy tales are an oral tradition. Women have this oral tradition. They'll sit down at a fireside and they'll talk to their grandchildren, tell their grandchildren these stories. And so they've been passed from generation to generation. They've turned from they've turned from goddesses, they've turned from, the Morrigan has turned from being part of the warrior goddesses of Ireland into a witch who's in fairy tales now, who's part of the fairy folk, but actually at her heart, at the root, is these old goddesses that were worshipped many thousands of years ago.
What do you hope that readers will take from this book?
I just want them. I love the thought of somebody sitting down and losing themselves in this book, maybe reading about some familiar names, but finding something new about familiar names, but also being introduced to completely brand new people to them, and new ideas for them, new kind of pantheons to them. Even, if somebody kind of sat down and read about the Japanese yokai for the first time and found their way into that through the story of Futakuchi Onna, then that'd be great. I kind of see it as it's almost like a springboard for you to you read a little story about somebody, you think that sounds it. This is my pantheon of goddesses. I'm going to go and find out some more about this, and I'm going and reading more deeply about it, perhaps, or just sit down and enjoying it. I just want people to be inspired to go and learn more for themselves, I think.
Today on Disobedient Femmes, my guest has been Kate Hodges, who is the author of Warriors, Witches, and Women. For people who are interested in finding more about your book and also finding more about your work, where can they go?
Just go to my website, just look me up on Google and you should find me. I think it's katehodges.org, or look me up on Instagram. I'm the THEE Kate Hodges, or Twitter, or come and find me on Facebook. I'm very friendly. Just come and say hello.
Thank you so much for being on Disobedient Femmes today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
I am Suzanne LaGrande. Each week on Disobedient Femmes, I bring you interviews with women artists, writers, and social change makers who are transforming the world. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a comment. Thanks.